Welcome to our Politics Point News channel. Here are today's top political news and updates. The story of Joe Biden's presidency is one marked by soaring hopes, crushing disappointments, and the relentless weight of expectation. When he took the oath of office on January 20th, 2021, standing before a Capitol still scarred by the insurrection just 2 weeks prior, Biden inherited a nation fractured beyond recognition. The pandemic raged unchecked, the economy teetered on the brink, and the very fabric of American democracy seemed to be unraveling thread by thread. He promised to be a healer, a unifier, a return to normalcy after 4 years of chaos. But the question that would haunt his entire presidency was whether any leader, no matter how experienced or well-intentioned, could bridge the chasm that had opened up in the American soul. Biden's approval ratings tell a story of their own, a narrative arc that begins with cautious optimism and descends into frustration and disillusionment. In those first months, his numbers hovered in the low to mid-50s, respectable if not spectacular. Americans wanted to believe that the steady hand of a career politician who had spent nearly 5 decades in Washington could guide them through the storm. The vaccine rollout accelerated, checks went out to families struggling to make ends meet, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the worst might be behind us. But approval ratings are fickle things, influenced by forces both within and beyond a president's control, and Biden would soon discover just how quickly the political winds can shift. The first major blow came not from any domestic policy failure, but from a foreign policy decision that would define his presidency in the eyes of many critics. The withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021 was supposed to end America's longest war, to bring closure to 2 decades of conflict that had claimed thousands of American lives and cost trillions of dollars. Biden had inherited a withdrawal agreement negotiated by his predecessor, and he chose to honor it, believing that the American people were tired of endless wars in distant lands. But the execution was catastrophic. The images that flooded television screens and social media feeds were searing. Desperate Afghans clinging to the landing gear of departing American planes, the Taliban sweeping through Kabul with shocking speed, the suicide bombing at Abbey Gate that killed 13 American service members and scores of Afghan civilians. The world watched in horror as the superpower that had toppled the Taliban in a matter of weeks 2 decades earlier now fled in chaos and disorder. The political fallout was immediate and severe. Biden's approval ratings, which had been slowly declining through the summer, plummeted. Republicans seized on the debacle as evidence of incompetence and weakness, while even some Democrats privately expressed dismay at the handling of the withdrawal. Biden defended the decision itself, arguing that staying would have meant more American casualties and an indefinite commitment with no clear endgame. He pointed out that the Afghan military, trained and equipped by the United States for years, had simply melted away in the face of the Taliban advance. But nuance and context mattered little in the face of such vivid images of failure. The Afghanistan withdrawal became a turning point, the moment when many Americans began to question whether Biden was up to the job he had campaigned so hard to win. Yet Afghanistan was only the beginning of Biden's leadership challenges. The pandemic, which he had promised to conquer with science and competence, refused to cooperate with any political timeline. Just when it seemed that vaccines would provide a path back to normalcy, the Delta variant surged through the summer of 2021, followed by the even more transmissible Omicron variant in the winter. Biden had set ambitious vaccination goals, even declaring a sort of independence from the virus on the 4th of July, 2021, only to watch helplessly as new waves of infection swept the country. His administration struggled to communicate clearly about evolving guidance on masks, boosters, and testing. The mixed messages eroded confidence, and the politicization of public health measures meant that millions of Americans simply tuned out federal guidance altogether. Biden found himself trapped between the demands of his progressive base to do more and the resistance of conservatives who viewed vaccine mandates and mask requirements as tyrannical overreach. The economic picture was equally complicated. Biden had championed the American Rescue Plan, a nearly $2 trillion relief package that sent checks to families, extended unemployment benefits, and provided aid to state and local governments. It was an ambitious effort to prevent the kind of prolonged economic misery that followed the Great Recession. And by many measures, it worked. The economy roared back to life. Unemployment fell faster than almost anyone had predicted, and wages rose, particularly for workers at the lower end of the income scale. But there was a price to pay for all that stimulus, a price that would become increasingly clear as 2021 turned into 2022. Inflation began to climb, slowly at first, then with alarming speed. By the summer of 2022, inflation had reached levels not seen in 4 decades. Americans felt it every time they went to the grocery store, filled up their gas tanks, or paid their rent. The pain was real and immediate, and no amount of talk about job creation or GDP growth could make it go away. Biden and his economic team initially dismissed the inflation surge as transitory, a temporary blip caused by supply chain disruptions and the unique circumstances of the pandemic recovery. But as months passed and prices kept rising, that characterization began to look either naive or disingenuous. The Federal Reserve, led by Jerome Powell, whom Biden reappointed, began raising interest rates aggressively to combat inflation, which had the side effect of cooling the economy and raising the specter of recession. Biden found himself in an impossible position, blamed for both the inflation itself and the measures taken to fight it. Republicans hammered him relentlessly on the economy, and polls showed that voters trusted Republicans more than Democrats on the issue that consistently ranked as their top concern. The legislative battles of Biden's first 2 years further complicated his standing with the public. He had come into office with Democrats controlling both chambers of Congress, albeit narrowly, and expectations were high that he could deliver on an ambitious progressive agenda. The American Rescue Plan passed on a party line vote, but that would be the easy part. Biden's next priority was a massive infrastructure bill, the kind of investment in roads, bridges, broadband, and public transit that both parties had talked about for years but never delivered. After months of painstaking negotiations, Biden managed to secure a bipartisan deal, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which passed with support from some Republicans. It was a genuine accomplishment, the kind of bipartisan legislation that had become vanishingly rare in modern Washington. But the victory was overshadowed by the ongoing battle over an even larger package, Build Back Better, which would have expanded the social safety net, addressed climate change, and raised taxes on the wealthy and corporations. Build Back Better became a symbol of Democratic dysfunction and the limits of Biden's power. Despite controlling both chambers, Democrats couldn't agree among themselves on the scope and cost of the legislation. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona wielded enormous power as swing votes, and they used that power to whittle down the package and ultimately to block it entirely in its original form. Progressives fumed at what they saw as obstruction by conservative Democrats, while moderates worried about the political risks of passing such an expensive bill amid rising inflation. Biden, caught in the middle, struggled to bring his party together. His decades of Senate experience, which was supposed to be his superpower, seemed insufficient to navigate the razor-thin margins and deep ideological divides within his own caucus. Eventually, a scaled-down version called the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the summer of 2022, but by then, much of the political momentum had been lost, and the bill's actual impact on inflation was debatable at best, despite its name. The Supreme Court added another layer of complexity to Biden's leadership challenges. In June 2022, the court overturned Roe v. Wade, ending nearly 50 years of constitutional protection for abortion rights. The decision sent shockwaves through American politics and galvanized Democrats heading into the midterm elections. Biden condemned the ruling and called on Congress to codify abortion rights into federal law. But with a Senate that couldn't even agree on Build Back Better, such legislation had no chance of passage. The president's options were limited, and activists grew frustrated with what they saw as insufficient action in response to a seismic shift in reproductive rights. Biden signed executive orders aimed at protecting access to abortion and contraception, but executive power can only go so far, and the real battles would be fought state by state. The Dobbs decision, as the case was known, energized Democratic voters and may have prevented the kind of electoral wipeout that many had predicted for the midterms. But it also highlighted Biden's inability to shape outcomes on issues that mattered deeply to his base. Immigration presented yet another intractable problem. Biden had promised a more humane approach than his predecessor, ending family separations and creating pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants brought to the country as children. But the reality at the southern border proved far more complicated than campaign rhetoric. When Biden took office, border crossings surged, driven by a combination of factors including deteriorating conditions in Central America, the perception that the new administration would be more welcoming, and the backlog created by pandemic-related policies. Republicans accused Biden of creating a border crisis through lax enforcement, while immigration advocates criticized him for continuing some of the very policies he had campaigned against, including the use of a public health authority called Title 42 to quickly expel migrants without allowing them to seek asylum. Biden found himself in the familiar position of being attacked from both sides, unable to satisfy either the demands of progressives who wanted more generous immigration policies or the concerns of moderates worried about the political fallout from images of overwhelmed border facilities. Attempts at comprehensive immigration reform went nowhere in Congress, leaving Biden to rely on executive actions that were immediately challenged in court and remained in legal limbo. The issue of student loan debt became another flashpoint. Biden had pledged during the campaign to provide some measure of student debt relief, though the extent and mechanism of that relief were always somewhat ambiguous. Progressives pushed for broad cancellation of student debt through executive action, arguing that the president had the authority to wipe out tens of thousands of dollars in debt for millions of borrowers. Biden hesitated, worried about the legal justification for such sweeping action and concerned about the cost and the fairness of forgiving debt for college graduates while doing nothing for those who never attended college or who had already paid off their loans. After months of pressure, he announced in August 2022 that his administration would cancel up to $10,000 in debt for most borrowers and up to $20,000 for those who had received Pell Grants. It was a compromise that pleased no one entirely. Progressives wanted more, conservatives called it an unfair giveaway, and legal challenges immediately put the program in jeopardy. The Supreme Court would eventually strike down the plan, forcing Biden to pursue more limited debt relief through existing programs and regulatory changes. Foreign policy beyond Afghanistan continued to test Biden's leadership. The relationship with China grew increasingly tense, with disputes over trade, human rights, Taiwan, and technology creating a complex web of competition and confrontation. Biden maintained Trump-era tariffs while adding new restrictions on semiconductor exports and investment in Chinese technology companies, arguing that national security required decoupling in key industries. The balloon incident in early 2023, when a Chinese surveillance balloon drifted across American airspace before being shot down, created a bizarre diplomatic crisis that further strained relations. Meanwhile, Biden tried to maintain what he called the guardrails of the relationship, ensuring that competition didn't spiral into conflict. It was a delicate balancing act, and critics on both sides questioned whether he was being too tough or not tough enough. But it was the war in Ukraine that would come to define much of Biden's foreign policy legacy and present perhaps his most significant leadership challenge on the world stage. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Biden rallied Western allies to support the Ukrainian resistance with weapons, intelligence, humanitarian aid, and devastating economic sanctions against Russia. The coordination of the international response was impressive, a demonstration of American leadership and NATO unity that few would have predicted after the Afghanistan debacle. Biden walked a careful line, providing enough support to help Ukraine defend itself while trying to avoid direct NATO involvement that could escalate into a broader war. He declassified intelligence to expose Russian plans, traveled to Europe repeatedly to shore up the coalition, and managed to keep disparate allies from Germany to Poland to the Baltic states on the same page. Ukraine's success in defending Kiev and eventually pushing Russian forces back from some occupied territories was due in large part to Western support coordinated largely by the Biden administration. Yet the Ukraine war also exposed divisions within the American public and limitations on Biden's ability to sustain support indefinitely. As the conflict dragged on month after month with no end in sight, questions arose about the endgame, the cost, and the risks. Republicans, particularly those aligned with Trump, began to question the level of aid being sent to Ukraine, arguing that American resources should be focused on domestic problems. By the time Biden sought additional funding for Ukraine in late 2023, he faced significant resistance in Congress, and aid packages became entangled with disputes over border security and other unrelated issues. Biden argued that supporting Ukraine was essential to defending democracy and deterring future aggression by autocratic regimes, but he struggled to convince Americans worried about inflation and the economy that sending billions to a country thousands of miles away should be a top priority. Throughout all these challenges, Biden's age became an increasingly prominent concern. He was 78 when he took office, the oldest president in American history, and every stumble, every verbal slip, every moment of confusion was amplified and dissected by media and political opponents. Biden had always been prone to gaffes, but now they took on new significance as potential evidence of cognitive decline. Videos of him appearing disoriented, calling out for deceased members of Congress, or trailing off mid-sentence went viral and fueled concerns about whether he was physically and mentally up to the demands of the presidency. The White House pushed back against these narratives, pointing to his legislative accomplishments and his performance in high-stakes diplomatic meetings. They argued that he was being held to a different standard because of his age, and that much of the criticism was driven by political opportunism rather than genuine concern. But the age issue wouldn't go away, and it would only become more acute as he contemplated running for re-election. Biden's communication style also emerged as a significant challenge. Unlike his predecessor, who dominated media coverage with provocative tweets and rallies, Biden was a more traditional politician who preferred prepared remarks and scripted events. This caution was intended to project stability and competence, but it often came across as stiff and out of touch. His approval ratings remained stubbornly low, even as economic indicators improved, a disconnect that frustrated his team and puzzled political analysts. Some attributed it to the media environment, arguing that negative news received far more attention than positive developments. Others pointed to a broader crisis of legitimacy affecting all institutions, not just the presidency. But whatever the cause, Biden struggled to break through, to connect with ordinary Americans, to make them feel that he understood their struggles and was fighting for them. His occasional attempts at more informal communication, like his State of the Union addresses where he showed flashes of the old combative Biden, were well received but couldn't change the overall trajectory of his approval numbers. The midterm elections of 2022 provided an unexpected bright spot. Historically, the president's party almost always loses seats in Congress during midterms, and with Biden's approval ratings underwater, many predicted a Republican wave that would give the GOP commanding control of both chambers. But the results defied expectations. Democrats lost the House by a narrow margin, but actually gained a seat in the Senate, giving them a slightly more comfortable majority. The overturning of Roe versus Wade proved to be a powerful motivator for Democratic voters, particularly women and young people, who turned out in higher numbers than typical for a midterm. Democratic candidates also benefited from Republican nomination of several extreme or flawed candidates in key Senate races, candidates who had been endorsed by Trump but struggled in general elections. Biden claimed vindication, arguing that his policies had put the party in a position to succeed and that voters had rejected extremism. But the mixed results also meant that he would face a Republican House majority determined to investigate his administration and his family, adding another layer of difficulty to an already challenging second half of his term. The investigations and political attacks on Biden and his family represented a constant drumbeat of distraction and controversy.